Today I want to speak about the second noble truth within Buddhism. Now, if you're interested in Buddhism and you're interested in the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path, then I highly recommend In the Buddha's Words. Now, this is a core text on the original teachings of the Buddha. And so it's essential reading not just for Theravada Buddhists or early Buddhists, it's important for Mahayana Buddhists, whether that is, Tibetan, Zen, or what have you, or Vajrayana Buddhists, but it's also important for people who want to study Buddhism. This is the starting place, and this book itself can be a bit of work because if you're not used to the repetitiveness of sutras in some of the classical texts, then this might wear you out. But if you enjoy these classical texts like I do, then this is a joy to read. So I highly recommend, this is why I recommend people to read first when they want to be introduced to Buddhism. So today I want to speak about the second noble truth. So probably more important than the other three noble truths. The second noble truth I feel is the most important for us to understand, especially for students of consciousness and for people who are truly interested in understanding the true nature of themselves and the universe. And so I'll read to you how the second noble truth appears in the original teachings. So, the second noble truth states, "Now this, monks, is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. It is this craving that leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there, that is, craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, craving for extermination." It can be such a mysterious piece of wisdom for those not familiar with Buddhist teachings and Eastern thought in general. But what we're talking about here when we talk about that the origin of suffering is craving is, if we're going to put it in more simplistic terms, is the origin of suffering is seeking. Craving is seeking. So this is what we're really talking about. And what the Buddha is speaking about is that the origin of suffering is the mind's habit and function to seek, its habit to crave things and other people and life in general, its habit of craving / seeking. And so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the second noble truth within Buddhism. So we're talking about the nature of seeking itself. So what we're speaking about in Buddhism and what the Buddha was speaking about is, why does this mind function this way? Why does it constantly seek a life that it doesn't have? Or why does it constantly seek things that it doesn't have? Now, when we look at the nature of the mind, we have to look at how thoughts operate. We have to look at the nature of thoughts to understand why this function of seeking happens. So when we look at the nature of thoughts themselves are spontaneously independent. They just bubble up one at a time. But what the mind does is it begins to link these thoughts together, which creates this illusion of an ego or of a persona. So we have this continuity of thoughts, creating this logical train of thought, which creates this illusion of a self, of a persona. And obviously that's one of the core teachings within Buddhism, that there is no real self, no real ego, that has developed through this function of seeking or craving, which actually just produces suffering, ironically. So we're in this habit of connecting and linking our thoughts together, which then creates the illusion of a person. So the mind is constantly seeking. But the irony here is that the mind truly wants to know itself. But we're caught in this habit of linking thoughts, which creates this illusion of a person, and then we create the suffering that we experience from this process. Everything from that process. So, like our ego identifies with a certain reality, which then we suffer from. This is all from that subtle level of linking thoughts and then create the ego, and then we identify with things, to defend ourselves in this illusion of who we are. So we have to understand that the mind is seeking itself, but we're caught in this habit of dysfunction of linking the thoughts together. And so what the mind actually is empty, spontaneous, and free. And this is what the mind wants to experience, but the mind is caught in this habit. We are caught in this habit of creating this sequence, this continuity of thoughts, creating this ego. And this all happens because of this habit of seeking, this constant seeking we have within our mind. We're seeking something we think we lack. We think that thing that we don't have, if we acquire it's going to be better, so forth and so on. So it's just this habit of seeking itself. And so what we truly want is we truly want the nature of the mind, and the nature of the mind is empty, spontaneous, and free. And so the only way to experience that is to begin to break up these linkages of thoughts. And then once we begin to break up these linkages of thoughts, then we begin to break up this habit of seeking, where we don't feel this continuity of a self, where we begin to live in the present moment and begin to live more spontaneously with joy as opposed to suffering. And so the reason why meditation is such a big part within Buddhism is because when you begin to meditate constantly every day, you're beginning to put spiritual solvent on these thoughts that are sticking together, and then they begin to loosen up and to begin to unlink from each other, and then you begin to experience reality as it truly is. And this is why within Buddhism, one of the core aspects is that, like I said, that thoughts themselves are truthfully independent and not dependent on other thoughts. We could call this the unsupported thought. They're not supported by other thoughts or not dependent on other thoughts. You can only come to that realization when you begin to observe your mind, maybe meditate more deeply, and put that spiritual solvent, meditation as that spiritual solvent, on the thoughts, beginning to unlink them. And then you begin to experience the world as it truly is, the mind as it truly is, in its empty, spontaneous, and free nature. This complete ease, what we could call the meditative mind. You're not blown here or there by emotions or anger or so forth and so on. And so we have that opportunity when we begin to meditate. That's what the second noble truth is really talking about. It's talking about that suffering comes from the seeking mind. And the seeking mind is the result of this habit of linking our thoughts together, creating this continuity of thoughts, creating this illusion of a person. And so meditation begins to break that up, and then you begin to see reality in the present moment, as opposed to your mind being projected into the future or looking back in the past. We are rarely in the present. See, the present is the most difficult for our mind to be when we're in this habit, because the mind is constantly in this process of looking into the future, because it's following the train of thought. This is what actually the wandering mind is. The wandering mind is just continually just moving and moving and moving, and we're following it, through just our constant habit and through a lack of wisdom and information and knowledge that we don't have access to. And so we just constantly follow this wandering mind, and then off down the rabbit hole we go, and then we begin to experience the suffering that we experience when we begin to identify too firmly as an ego. In Buddhism, this ability to live from that natural mind, which is empty, spontaneous, and free, is the idea of Prajna in Sanskrit. So Prajna being spontaneous, non-dual wisdom or knowledge. So Prajna is basically that understanding that the reality is one, but can only be experienced in its true unified state of oneness when we are not linking the thoughts together, when we are not seeking. The seeking takes us away from our true oneness with everything else. And so Prajna, when we begin to practice meditation, we begin to experience Prajna, because the thoughts begin to separate and we begin to experience reality in its true spontaneity. Actually, in Zen Buddhism, this is the core part of the teaching. The core part of the teaching in Zen Buddhism is to come back to your natural mind, which is empty, spontaneous, free, which I've said about 1,000,000 times already, but I need to reiterate that because we need to understand that. And so part of Zen Buddhism is that when you go through processes like when you go through koan training. Koans is basically a riddle or a question to try and evoke an immediate response from the student that the master poses to the student. And so in koan training, the master is trying to get you to act immediately, but also be appropriate to the situation. So first of all, immediacy may come. Immediacy may come in your response, but it may not be appropriate to the question that the master asked you. So the end of the training usually ends with immediacy and also being appropriate to that situation. And this is the result of getting out of the mind's habit of seeking. Because when you begin to understand that the thoughts are unsupported, and they happen one like this, through extensive meditation, then you begin to see exactly what is needed in that moment. There's a story, I love this story. It's the story of a young Japanese man who goes to learn fencing. And when he goes to learn fencing, he asks the master, like, okay, so where's the weapons and how do I start? And the master's like, don't worry about that. Just go and wash the dishes. And so, the student thought, well, I'll do whatever the master says. So he washes the dishes, he's washing the dishes. And then the master comes out of nowhere and cracks him in the ribs with the fencing stick. And then the student's like, wow. Oh. So then the next day he's washing the dishes and the student is, he's devising a plan to defend the blow to the ribs. And then the master cracks him on the butt. So the next day, he's devising a plan to protect the butt, and then the master hits him on the shoulder. This goes on for months. So then the student realizes that all of his effort to build a plan to deal with spontaneity are all flawed, because he doesn't know what is going to happen, because he's not really there in the present moment. He's devising a plan to deal with the future. He's not in the present moment. And so the next day, the student is completely calm and tranquil. He's meditating, completely present. And then the master goes to crack him in the nose and he catches the stick. Because the student is in the present moment. He is in that immovable place of presence within himself, not blown here or there by his thoughts of future or past, or this continuity of thought, this logical train of thought. He is completely in the present moment. And he acts with immediacy, and he is appropriate to what is needed in that situation. He obviously blocks his nose getting broken. So that is part of Buddhism and part of Zen training in general, is to get you back into that natural mind, get you back into that immediacy, but also acting appropriate to what is needed in that situation. That is what the second noble truth of Buddhism is about. It's about getting out of that seeking mind, which blows us here and there and causes a lot of trouble and leads us into suffering, because we are caught in this trap of this person who we think we are, which is built on this continuity of thoughts, which is just the result of a function of seeking that the mind is in. But we have the opportunity to bring our mind back into the present moment, where we can begin to act immediately and appropriate to what is needed in the situation. And we all have that chance if we choose meditation and we choose to understand that our mind is going here and there and taking us away from our true presence, from the place that we can only be, which is in the present moment, where everything arises from and everything goes back to. Shanti, shanti, shanti.